Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today I'm speaking with Jennifer Scheller, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Clinical Trials at Merck, a company that invested nearly $18 billion in R&D in 2024 and conducts trials in over 60 countries at more than 21,000 trial sites with more than 100,000 active patients supported, a pretty sizable clinical operation, I would say. I'm excited to chat with Jennifer about her career path leading up to her current role at Merck and the process for integrating clinical programs that Merck acquires. And we'll also talk about the clinical trial modernization and democratization. I want to get Jen's thoughts on that. We'll touch on Merck's functional service provider model, as well as what new tools and technologies Merck is using to improve clinical trial operations. Thank you so much for being here, Jen.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You have more than 25 years of experience in clinical development and operations, beginning as a clinical research assistant in contract research, as a clinical scientist at Wyeth before leading portfolio and disease area clinical operations at companies including Sanofi, Kyowa Kirin, and now Merck, of course, both domestically and internationally. Jen, what attracted you first to clinical development as a field?
Yeah, I think like many of the professionals in clinical operations, especially, we sort of stumble upon clinical trial operations. I've always loved science. I've always had a passion for public health. My mom was a community nurse, and often in my childhood, she would take us around in different parts of the community running health fairs and clinics. And I was just very inspired by the impact that she made in her community. And for me, I always wanted to, build a career in healthcare in some capacity. And so I finished a degree in molecular biology. I realized I wasn't going to be a lab person. That just wasn't my thing. I had plenty of jobs in college to kind of tease that out. And then I went on straight to get a master's in public health epidemiology, balancing, that public health impact with my love of science and data together. And then really, as I was graduating, I had a colleague who just said, "Hey, I'm working as a clinical research assistant at Covance in Nashville. I was down at UAB in the South," and she said, "You should check out this company in this field. It integrates a lot of what we have studied with clinical research design." And so that was my entree. I interviewed at Covance, which is now Fortrea. It's had a few different spin-offs from there. And I had my first job in Princeton, New Jersey as a clinical research assistant. And I was really attracted to the impact that you can make through clinical trials and also the need for good problem solvers and operational skills. I'm the type of person who likes to get things done on my checklist and get things moving and feeling productive. So it was a great fit for me.
Yeah, well, I would imagine with so many clinical trials going on all over the world, it's I know it's a big job to make all of the trains run on time, but you have to have that kind of personality. I would think that is really focused on executing, on meeting very specific goals on a very specific timetable. That was not something that was daunting to you. You embraced that and enjoyed that kind of work, I guess it sounds like.
Yeah, and I love the challenges because it's not textbook stuff, right? I mean, you have 60 pages of good clinical practice regulation, but then you have to apply that to the real world and not
Right.
just one country or one hospital. It's so that was always very intriguing to solve for problems and help move forward clinical trials.
Yeah, and that means working with people, lots of different kinds of people, lots of different kinds of health systems.
That's right. That's right.
Thinking, I guess, back to that early experience at Covance and all the way forward, you've worked at some other really large companies I've just named. What are the biggest or most impactful changes that have occurred in clinical development and operations, since you got started back in the late 1990s?
I would say the volume of R&D that's really exploded over the years. There was an uptick post-COVID, but it's progressively been increasing with a focus on science and R&D. I think there's a 500,000 clinical trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And so it's exploded. And it was nice to see if there's a silver lining in the COVID pandemic, that the public started to understand, how new medicines and vaccines were made. Operationally, I would say, when I first started in the late 90s, it was, triple NCR paper. So we'd go out to the hospitals to make sure that the records in the hospital system matched what was handwritten on an NCR form. And then as a clinical research associate, you'd be ripping off the forms and however many you could bring back into house. And so as in the early years of my work there, that transformed into electronic data capture, so it's still, I would say, an area for modernization because today the staff at research sites have to enter it into a computer system, into our data collector, but it's really looking at the health record and seeing what needs to be pulled into the data collector. There are some pilots, to automate some flow of the data. It's not so easy because, looking across all these different countries and lack of standardization is an area ripe for modernization. But paper to the electronic data capture was a huge one we all sort of reflect on. And we haven't had, to be honest, too many transformative changes like that in operations over the years. And now there's really a big push to be more modern, technologies moving so quickly. So we're on the train and moving and changing and working on automation and things like that. And I would also say too, precision medicine has been a tremendous evolution in drug development and especially in oncology. It's been game changing with, immunotherapies and really providing meaningful impact to the lives of cancer patients. When I ran trials many, many years ago in the traditional chemo radiotherapy models, I mean, the trials were short because the treatments didn't work. And now, we're
Yeah.
following patients for, many, many years, which is really incredible.
Yeah, and of course now we're getting, even better, not just, novel cancer therapeutics, but even better, more targeted chemotherapy and better and more targeted radiopharmaceuticals. That's an area that I've been watching and is a really interesting one and is especially for cancer. And I want to come back to the idea of modernization in just a minute. I'm curious about, you mentioned some of the technologies and the shifting from, the previous shifting from paper to electronic data capture, but there's still this sense that healthcare lags other industries. There are still Excel files being
Yes.
used out there, still PDFs that don't exactly make it easy for data capture sometimes. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for drug development and healthcare more broadly to kind of leapfrog forward and maybe catch up with some of the industries that have moved forward. There's a whole other conversation there about, the regulatory restraint and the need, we're talking about human lives, so everything has to be very carefully done. So it's not the same as other industries. But I am curious if there's an opportunity now, to kind of catch up in some ways and get to a more modern, less complex system for conducting clinical trials. We'll come back to that, I promise, in a few minutes. But I just, thinking about your career trajectory and, working at companies like Sanofi and Kyowa Kirin, did those experiences help you think about strategy or models for clinical trial operations that you bring to your current job? I'm sure that different companies do things a little bit differently, right?
They do. There's similarities, even in small biotech. Sometimes they're like mini pharmas, how they set up their functionalities. But I spent about 13 years at large pharma at Sanofi and went to a small biotech, Kyowa Kirin, shortly thereafter, before coming back into large pharma here at Merck for over 8 years. And what I really saw in operating models, there was a time in the industry where people, pharma companies hired all their clinical operations staff, and then there was this pivot where, companies felt it would be best to outsource all the operations, and so there was sort of this massive shift to outsourcing, and it's really over time has sort of reverted back, and it's a bit of a hybrid now, but what I saw in the large pharma environment was, outsourced, insourced works best because you need to be able to integrate directly into the teams making decisions. And having a company that sort of sits outside, that's not part of the team, creates different goals for teams, and it's not really a united front, and it becomes a little bit of a finger pointing exercise, and there's maybe different goals and missions that people are focused on. The outsourced models in the large companies is really challenging, but it is needed in small biotechs because they don't have the arms and legs that the big pharma has. So some of that functional outsourcing is really important. So what really attracted me in coming into Merck was through a leader who I worked with at Sanofi, Andy Lee. So he came into Merck and really shifted the paradigm from fully outsourced model to bringing everything in-house. So he brought everything in-house and built an operating model where we have, 60% headcount through our company and then 40% or so through functional service provider. And so that enables really, and the functional service provider model, in this environment, they follow all the same processes as the Merck team. So it's one team, one set of processes, one set of what do we feel is compliant? What is the level of compliance? We all have the same targets and goals and really infused integrating into one team. And as a clinical trial site, you wouldn't know if you were working with somebody who has a paycheck from Merck or if somebody has a paycheck for one of the CROs that's in the FSP model. And that's what sites really want. They want a direct contact to the sponsor. They want a direct contact to the person who's really leading the study so they can get quick answers and so that things aren't sort of hopping through different levels and takes a lot of time and churn to get, the right source of information. So for me, that was my biggest learning, working across the different organizations and just understanding, how do you bring the best of the talent together in a model that's going to work within the environment effectively.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the functional service provider model. It sounds like it's one that you like. I mean, you came to Merck and we're as a support, a way to support that model. You like that model. How does that? Can you maybe just talk a little bit about how that is set up or how it works differently? Particularly in other countries where if you have a local organization that you're working with and on a fully outsourced model, it's pretty easy to understand. I mean, it's a kind of almost turnkey. You just hand kind of everything over to the outsourced provider. Whereas with the functional service provider model, you have, as you say, internal Merck employees collaborating very closely with these external groups. Is it difficult to set I mean, you're working in, 60 plus countries. Is it difficult to set up those functional service provider models in each of the areas where you're working? Is there a kind of playbook now that you have to do it so that you can replicate it and
Sure.
do it easily? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and there's definitely certainly a common standard approach here, and it really starts with partnership, with the CROs and working together as partners. So the CRO understands the skill you're looking for and the oversight expectations and the standards expectations, and it's coming together regularly to get feedback on what's working and feedback from their staff because everyone brings diverse and good feedback and interesting ideas to the table. So, these big CROs have a massive outreach globally. Maybe not all CROs fit my 52 offices that we have, in the world. So you have to maybe have this CRO that manages two CROs that manage maybe, this in Europe. Maybe you have different ones for Africa and Asia Pacific and the US, but having a core set of CROs that we work with, for functional service providers has really been key. And then aligning on like what do we expect so we don't human resource manage the staff that come from the CRO. So you have to really develop expectations on what you expect their managers to do and then have a forum where, empowering in the country, for example, where the CRO management team works together with the Merck team so that they, are partnering, giving feedback and making sure they're really working as one team. At this trial team level, it's really seamless. Like it's not, they're sitting at a clinical trial team meeting and they wouldn't say, oh, well, that CRM or country manager is from this CRO and this one is a Merck employee. That's not how it works. It's seamless at the trial level because we're all following the same standards, processes, Merck email, laptops, equipments, iPads for monitoring. So it's really integrating as one team, and it works. And that's really what attracted me to come to the Merck organization because of this operating model build and because of the challenges that I saw in the outsource model. If you think of outsource model, typically it's you contract study by study, right?
Right.
But that's not how research works. Like, so if you have unitized pricing for a given study, X number of monitoring visits, X number of phone calls to a site, that's not the real world because you might have a safety signal where you need extra monitoring. And then if you're in these unitized or outsourced contracts, then you have to worry about change orders and then versus flexing your staff across the trials because as one trial sort of dips, another one's going to pick up. So you can have flexibility and agility to use your resources in a real world environment. And that's how trials work. You need to sort of shift folks around and it doesn't work well when you have a large scale volume of trials and then you have to sort of unitize across each one.
Yeah, right. And it makes sense what you said, about having some core CDMO partners that, once you've kind of set up this arrangement and then for example, want to go into an adjacent market or I guess if it's a market that particular CDMO is working in, then they already know, the
Right.
arrangement is already set up, the process is already set up, and it's easy to kind of seamlessly move into a new trial, into a
That's
new
right.
market because you already have kind of the working orders established.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
You joined Merck in 2017, Jen, and initially I think worked on integrating acquired companies' R&D activities into Merck's R&D operations. And this is a topic I think that the Business of Biotech listeners will be interested in hearing from you on because of the amount of deal activity is one of the positive things in the kind of broader funding environment that's happening right now. The IPO market is sluggish. There are a few happening, but it's still fairly slow. But we are seeing deal activity kind of pick up a little bit. I wonder, what you could say, Jen, about your approach and Merck's approach to integrating companies. Maybe you could use, for example, some of the companies that you worked with when you joined, Peloton Therapeutics, Velos Bio, Acceleron. What does that integration process look like?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start, I'll share the Peloton example that they came forward with a product that we got our first approval within 2 years of acquiring Peloton. And that's really, our model is focusing on preserving the science and the expertise, hence the reason for acquiring the company. And, in some of the integrations, Peloton was finishing their phase 2 and we started the phase 3 in our model. So that was a little bit easier, although they had an ongoing registrational phase 2 where we had to really keep the team intact. So it's, when biotechs get the word of acquisition, there's probably mixed emotions depending on the levels, but most people are worried about their jobs, right? They're supporting their families and it sets a bit of
Right.
panic. So the first thing, as a leader in approaching an integration, and I was like the operational lead for R&D, was really getting out there face to face. That's invaluable straight away. And just making sure that people understood the ethos of our company and how we're a people first company and high bar of ethics. And, we will make sure that people are cared for in this environment. And that's what we did. And we made things very clear on retention and we wanted the talent to stay. And we made a concerted effort to interview everybody who wanted, to stay with the company and where there could be a potential fit. And that's not always the case because the profiles perhaps at biotechs largely aren't always interested in coming into large pharma. But the face-to-face piece and the connection is key. And then really understand what you're getting, making sure you have a robust sort of due diligence debrief with your broader Merck team who's going to help shepherd the acquired company in through all of the Merck systems and processes. But what's really important is doing an assessment, and this is, I think, where my background comes into play because I've done insourced and outsourced. I'm not stuck on one company way of working, but looking at, how trials are running and deciding like what's really needed to move into the Merck process and system, probably things like the safety database over time. What's okay to keep as is because it is GCP compliant. It might not be the way that, Merck would do it in their model, but what can we keep running and keep that pivotal, registrational phase two going? That was a rare disease indication that got approval. So it's really having sort of that pragmatic approach and also approaching, the biotech staff that, we're going to learn from them. It's not just us coming in and taking over and acquiring, but what can we learn from you and approaching it in a collaboration way. And then you got to make sure that each function that supports clinical trials has their own sort of playbook of things that they need to go through to make sure that they have covered and some of the fundamentals in processes for clinical trials so that we're mitigating any risk if there's any gaps. A lot of times it can involve relooking at the CRO contract. Was it too skinny, too light? Do we need to make sure that there's enough monitoring built in here? And so on and so forth. And then having a kickoff with the outsourced parties as well. So it's all about connectivity, the people component, but then really bringing in, the process without disrupting, especially for in-flight. Acceleron had a large phase three program that was probably the most challenging integration. So we really had to preserve and make sure that those studies were supported and running without trying to Merckify things, as we say, and shifting, ways of working. There's some things inherently that you just have to move over. But by and large, in operations where, you can sustain and maybe enhance a little bit of the standards, was really the approach we took. And then building a governance so you can make sure that we have the right controls and oversight. And, when I came into the Peloton integration, it was we didn't have a playbook. We didn't have like a standard way of doing it. So we built it along the way. And I actually hired one of my summer interns to extend her stay for a project to shadow us and build the playbook out. We had some consultants come in and it was creating more chaos than no offense to consultants, but it was creating a lot more chaos than help. And so we had her sort of shadow us and built this beautiful playbook, and that's became the foundation and standard for how we conduct our integrations from an operations standpoint moving forward.
Oh, that's really interesting. And so you have a playbook, but it sounds like you're also approaching each company, in a unique way, looking at them as a unique organization, what they need, maybe what they don't need. And so there is a little bit of give and take. It's not like, it's a complete standardization, no matter what phase you're in or what, therapy you're developing. There's, you're looking at an individual company and making some decisions that may not be the same for each company in terms of how you do that integration. Is that fair to say?
That's fair. And I think, the respect for people part is really key because I've heard some horror stories of other integrations where companies just came in and said everyone's gone in 3 months. And, for Peloton, they got the messaging very early that they had a long transition plan. And in between, we would support them to look at opportunities if they were interested in staying in the long term. So it's really kind of reducing that anxiety and taking care of people is really fundamental to making it successful because you need people to still be engaged. There's trials that are active and running, and as our company, we weren't ready to just jump in and take over. We had no idea ways of working, processes, and it's not all cleanly outsourced to a CRO. In many cases, a lot of times the biotechs will have different functions running certain sections on their own process, and it's a lot of mixed ways of working that you need time to understand and get your team on the ground. And I would say, for Peloton, defending an inspection 2 years after integration, it was really important that we still had Peloton staff with us to help explain some of the history, and that was invaluable. And that's really only possible because we approach them, cross-functionally as one team to really come in and value their experience and delivery.
Right. I mean, we've seen some, and I think it's I see it less commonly now, but larger pharmaceutical companies who at times I've seen in the past acquire a company and say, we're going to let this company work completely independently. We're gonna be here for support, but we're gonna be sort of hands off. And I think you kind of alluded to the challenge with that type of arrangement. I guess I'm thinking, of Bayer and a number of companies that they acquired, kind of in the cell therapy area. But what I guess is the challenge with doing it, running it that way, letting a company be wholly independent. What you know, what difficulties I guess are presented by that arrangement versus a kind of custom integration that you're describing.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of different models of how you can approach it. And I think, a standalone model can preserve a therapeutic area maybe that the company doesn't have, where
Right.
it would take a tremendous amount of effort to build. And I think having the right governance model in place, that can certainly be successful too. But where you're integrated, like for oncology, we have a lot of experience. We brought in the HIF-2 alpha inhibitor from Peloton and renal cell carcinoma, and VHL was our first indication. We had a very well-established oncology therapeutic area to integrate into. So, it just probably depends on the breadth of the company's experience because it'll take a lot to upskill in a new therapeutic area.
Is Merck currently, in terms of acquisitions, I'm not going to ask you, who Merck is going to acquire next, but are you focused kind of on those seven key therapeutic areas plus vaccines, or does, Merck think about acquiring companies beyond, areas where you're currently focused?
Yeah, I don't know that I could speak well to that. I mean, our focus is following the science and bringing the best value to the patients. We've had a lot of diversity in our acquisitions. You can look at immunology. That was an area we haven't been in a while with the Prometheus acquisition, for example. So
Right.
we have quite a diverse portfolio as it stands today and growing.
Clinical trials, you alluded to this earlier, have gotten more complex over time, driven by new drug modalities, new regulatory designations and pathways, new scientific discoveries, among other things. Regardless of company size, developers are looking for ways to simplify and modernize clinical development to be as efficient as possible, especially in a time when funding is not always easy to obtain for smaller and mid-sized biotechs in particular. But they don't want to miss out on potential value that a new development candidate represents. What are your thoughts on how protocols can be simplified?
Yeah, and this is, I would say, really a huge opportunity in the industry because we have this bad habit of taking protocols and copying and pasting, similar indications to the other and bringing forward maybe some extensive data collection points or inclusion exclusion criteria that aren't necessarily needed. So we are focused on protocol lean design as a key initiative or objective for our development organization. And it really you need to start with the end in mind, that we have to stop the copy paste and, what particular research question are you answering? What do you need to answer that question from an endpoint standpoint? We have a tool where you can plug in the schedule of activities that measures site burden and
Hmm.
patient burden and looks at it like in a competitive landscape to say, if you have a phase 3 and this indication, what it looks like from a burden score compared to other programs and really having discipline to take things out. And the other thing I think we really need to think about is just, as you think about the ICH Good Clinical Practice framework, it's fit for purpose, focusing on what matters and being very cautious to add any extra burden into the system with exploratory endpoints, for example. And maybe even some of the secondary, do you need to assess it in all patients in a phase 3, or could you do a sub-study? Do you need your visit frequency, every 2 months, or could it be, could you have some flexibility with your visit windows? Could there be visits that are done remotely and built into your schedule events? So, easing the burden for patients. But protocols are becoming more and more complex, and this is really an area that we all have to double down on. There was a really interesting, tough study recently that looked at data collection and over the last decade or so, I think they quoted that we've increased data collection in trials more than threefold. I think it was like 3.5 increase in data collection. So it's not just, you know, specifically the processes and visits, procedures that you're putting into your designs, but also the volume of data that you're asking to correlate for that. So we have to have good discipline and rigor. And then, when you think about protocol simplification, the whole ecosystem needs to be simplified. So as you're, leaning your protocols, you need to start to think about leaning your data collection so it's fit for purpose. And then how you clean the data. We're looking very deeply at how our teams are querying the data, which adds work to our research sites, right? And so do we need to query all data the same? Can you tier your data so it's more risk proportionate? So really looking at, I would say, the full ecosystem downstream of the protocol development and simplifying. We've just become incredibly complex over time and trying to answer a lot of research questions in one design. And where we can, focus on what's most important will really help everyone at the end.
That's really interesting. It kind of reminds me of, I think, a period maybe 5 or 10 years ago where there was a lot of excitement about new types of data that could be captured. And
Yes,
there was a
right.
feeling almost that,
Yeah,
the more data, the merrier. Like,
that's
let's
right.
just, like capture as much data as we possibly can. And then on the back end, we'll figure out, where the value is. But, what you're saying is that, complicates trials. It makes them perhaps last longer, cost more, and that there needs to be, a kind of trimming, a bringing this, focusing it more to answer a specific question that you're trying to ask rather than, just simply capturing as much data as you possibly can.
That's right. And think about the burden. You can think of like the ECOA assessments, the outcome assessments, or the PROs, they would call them, patient reported outcomes. So, trials have added lots of those into the system that collects a lot of data. And then that requires quality control and cleaning and reconciliation. So that's you have to add that work into your team. Then you have to add that work into the clinical trial sites. And what I've noticed just over the years is while we've thrown out a lot more data, we haven't developed cleaning mechanisms that apply the technology rigor of automation to do this in a very efficient manner. So you see a lot of sort of old skills being applied to clean massive amounts of data. You still see sometimes Excel for diary information that's collected in, thousands of patients. And so this is where we're really working to support our teams and bring more of the technology skills. But we need it from the vendors too. There's a lot of vendors in the clinical trial environment. You have lab vendors, you have the ECOA vendors. Um, you have the IRT vendors. I mean, you probably have 7 or 8 different vendors in any given study, and that's a lot of data collected across them. And what I'd like to see more holistically is just mechanisms to automate more of the reconciliation versus putting the burden on, the sponsor teams to try to figure out and build tools. And one area that our industry is really trying to figure out these days is how do we leverage audit trail data in systems to give us, and we have to start to do this because it's become part of the good clinical practice guidelines. But, how can we do this at scale with efficiency, to give us quality control signals in our trial oversight? So all that new data has come in. I would say it's been a bit of old-fashioned cleaning and reconciliation. That's really an opportunity to not only trim, but then identify more efficient ways to do quality control of this massive volume of data.
You mentioned the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, I believe.
That's right.
Would you mind just mentioning how, you know, whether Merck works directly with that group or how you use the various tools and guidance that they provide?
Yeah, and so that really, the ICH Good Clinical Practice Framework is the international standard for conducting research. So, I mean, we're all following ICH Good Clinical Practice. That's the foundation, and that gives the common core of how research can be done globally with a common set of standards. U.S. is an adopter. Many of the large countries are adopters, and it's the framework you'll see in probably any global company. So they haven't updated the good clinical practice guidelines quite very often for a long period of time. I think it was like 10 years before the section around clinical trial oversight was updated. And then they updated it again in a couple years. So we had a recent update this year, and that's revision three. And this is, I think, from 1996, so revision three, and it's it's taken that long of time. But revision three is really, I would say, a tailwind in the clinical trial operational delivery because Revision three is emphasizing risk proportionality as a principle, not an option, but as a principle of how research is conducted, meaning you don't treat all of your data the same. You focus on critical data and processes with a higher amount of rigor. You take more risk-based approaches, in your data cleaning and quality control. And our industry has really struggled with that over the years. You still see some organizations doing 100% manual cross checks, what we call as source data verification. So sending people in the field to do 100% checks of what's in your collector versus what's in an electronic health record. And we found even 10 years ago plus, there was a paper that, really kind of dispelled the myth of the value of doing that cross check with Transcelerate, which is a consortium of pharma, working to advance our industry and bring forward best practices. And they had a really interesting publication and study where they showed only like 2 to 3% of critical data changed from all of that effort doing that cross check.
Wow.
But yet you still see many organizations are shifting away from that. And some are even thinking, do I need to do that check at all? Could we just determine the outliers and anomalies in centralized methods? So we're playing around right now. We don't do 100%. We're looking to see how we can do more central monitoring to sort of support quality control measures. But yeah, it's really lots of opportunity. It's been a slow evolution, but I really think today with the pricing pressures in our pharma landscape, but also the regulatory changes and pressures, the need to go fast, it's not optional. And technology is certainly providing a lot of opportunity where we can take this and run and do things differently.
I think this is a great segue to the idea of modernizing clinical development. It's something that I've heard FDA Commissioner Macri talk about recently, the importance of modernizing the clinical enterprise. Other biotech and pharma leaders have mentioned it, and I'm curious what modernization means to you in this context. And maybe we've already been talking about modernization, but what does it mean to modernize clinical trials?
Yeah, I would say from an operational standpoint, not a design standpoint, because there's lots of opportunity. I'm sure that's, in the strategic thinking of the FDA. But, when I think about modernizing clinical trial operations, I think about simplifying with rigor based on that R3 update, with really focusing on risk proportionality, making sure that processes aren't overly heavy. So we've sort of what happens, I think, over time is, you develop processes, you get an inspection, oh, there's a finding, and then you apply, a lot of change and extra checks in place. And, coming back, is this worth it? Is it working? Is it adding value? Like really, for me right now in our environment, we have to challenge our ways of working. And, I'll give you one example. We have in clinical trials, you have to collect deviations from the protocol. So if a clinical trial site isn't compliant with your protocol, you have to log all those deviations. Some are not important, could be you're a day out of window for your visit, you're late on something, and some could be incredibly important. Like there was a patient wasn't consented for a trial. That's applies a different level of focus. And, in some of these processes, we apply the same amount of rigor to those non-important protocol
Mm.
deviations as we do to the important ones. So for me, that's a dial down. That's where AI can help me trend the non-important deviations for the oversight. So when we see trends, using natural language processing, because there's a lot of qualitative text and how these things are reported, there's categories too, but to get into the meat, you have to dig in a bit. I think that's where teams are struggled. But here, this is where AI can help, directing our teams to trend better and to say, hey, this is a trend we're seeing in ECGs missed at week 13, and sort of understanding the patient journey and the flow, and maybe digging in there versus going, patient by patient and in the review, and providing maybe a bit too much resource and effort. So simplifying with rigor, focusing on what matters most. We are really focused on redefining our risk-based quality management operating model, which is really looking at how do we define what is critical first? Because, a lot of times you can see teams identify 50 different things that they think that are critical, but that's not providing, sort of that differentiation focus. And you need experience to help teams with that, to say, this is your primary endpoint, key secondary, this is most critical, and really try to help our teams narrow that down and couple that with, highly robust oversight, coupling more of that central monitoring type of activity, and that would be programmatically cross-checking data versus sending that person in the field, just relying on that type of check. And then thinking about like your other tiers of data and what types of quality checks you want to put in place. It could be, maybe you apply an edit check on a data that's not critical and you issue questions to the site if it's out of a range, and then you leave it when the site responds versus, continuing to sort of perseverate on it and applying different decisions that apply true risk-based methodologies into ways of working. So that's how I view modernization. It's really applying more fit for purpose ways of working. You have to document it. You have to be very clear on your decisions and documenting. But there's just been a lot of, I would say, old-fashioned ways of working and traditional ways of working. I think an over-reliance on manual checks that happen in the field and how that's all documented versus modernizing through, programmatic reconciliation, automation of checks, all that external data that I mentioned that was coming in, and making sure teams have a dashboard where they can see this site is missing, they didn't do this procedure at this visit and they're red, they need a follow-up. You have to send that field person out to retrain and get them back into compliance. So it's that to me is really where we can be more effective, efficient, and leveraging technology to how it can best support our teams. I have one, funny story. We bring a lot of interns in every summer and really trying to infuse blending sort of tech skills and clinical scientist skills. And one of our interns shared with me, I said, so how's it working? Do you have any ideas like on where we can automate more, where you're seeing a lot of heavy Excel tracker, movement and email updates and things like that? And she said, Jen, she's like, it's not even using just Excel. She's like, they're not, I see people using Excel as a Word document, like typing a lot of text into Excel and not applying formulas. So there's a lot of opportunity to really help and make things, more automated and efficient. And it's people just have to have an open mind to learn from others and see how things can be done differently.
And so at Merck, when you're wanting to maybe introduce new tools to improve, this process, dial something back, as you mentioned, is that a conversation that you're having through the functional service provider group of folks? You're talking to the site as well as
Yes.
internally with people at Merck and kind of getting agreement and at least, informing everyone, how something is going to change going forward. Is that right?
Yeah, and we have exactly. We have a process owner network. So like owners of specific, we have all these processes to follow in clinical development, and how you run your study is governed by your processes, which are in line with those ICH guidelines that I mentioned. So for me, it starts with the process owner, make sure they have the right training to do lean design and efficiencies, and also couple them with technology experts so they can look at the process from first a simplification manner, but then where can technology help perform some of these areas of the process? The example I mentioned with, the deviations and using AI to do trending, and it's sort of coupling and marrying those types of skills. But then we don't make decisions in a vacuum. So we engage our teams, those that are working at the clinical trial level, and that could be the FSP resources through the CRO, or it could be, our own headcount staff. And if it's a process that involves or impacts our clinical trial sites, we do survey our sites every year to say what's working well, where do we need to improve. But we also have a network of sites that we tap into and sit down and walk them through what we're thinking. What do you think? Does this make sense? And we've had some sites who, came forward and said, hey, look, we're not going to do this trial unless you do apply the R3 changes and having non-physician investigators or sub-investigators in the trial. We can't do this study unless we can use our nurse practitioners. So we brought it back to our development forum. It's beyond operations, and we changed our process, where we now have built into the protocol where it's appropriate to have the non-physician some investigators. So it can go both ways. It can be driven by us, and as we learn through our peers, we're part of a lot of industry consortiums, but it can also bubble up from research sites around the globe to tell us, hey, this isn't working. This we need to change, and we're open and we listen. And having a seat at the table from our clinical trial sites is so important that we don't turn into ivory tower decision makers.
Is it possible for sponsor companies that, maybe don't have this functional service provider model or working in more of a fully outsourced model to communicate with their CDMO partners and have that kind of information exchange and even, make some changes? It may be more difficult. I don't know, but is there any advice, I guess, that you would have for perhaps smaller biotech companies who are working on more of a fully outsourced model, how to think about and implement some of these
Yeah.
things?
I mean, from my experience in the biotech and working through all these integrations, my advice is treat your CRO like a partner. Because if it becomes a very tactical relationship and fear-based and finger pointing, you won't get anywhere. I had one, environment where I really had to turn around some of the relationships and the team dynamics to make sure that we were listening to the CRO. They had very valid feedback and points and behaviors that we needed to change, on the sponsor side. So I would just really encourage you approaching it like a partner. And every sponsor, biotech or big pharma, should be sitting down with sites regularly. I think biotechs do a nice job at getting out there because, at all levels, they're really vested in partnering with sites and getting their feedback and having the CRO sort of around the table as one team, even if it's not an FSP model. I think the behaviors and the way that we work together in a partnership way just goes a tremendous way. Every year we have a forum where we celebrate, we bring in all of our supplier leaders, not just FSP, but the labs, all the key vendor leaders across the ecosystem that we couldn't, frankly, do this work without. And we come together and we talk about the vision and the strategy, our portfolio, and then we also celebrate, how where things worked well. And we have forums where they're bringing forward, they've got a bigger line of sight across the industry too, like where are they seeing ways that we can improve. So for biotechs, it's just be open to feedback, and operations makes a difference. It's not just the science, the beauty of the science, but it's being able to execute in a feasible manner really makes a difference. And I would also just add, when we talked about simplifying protocols, one key area is bring the sites in early. Don't just
Mm.
hand them a final protocol. Like walk the protocol with your sites, maybe walk it with your lab vendor to make sure all these, shipments are feasible across the different specialty labs and what the turnaround time is going to be and how that impacts, a patient who's waiting to know if they're eligible for a cancer therapy. So, taking the proactive steps up front just goes a tremendous, tremendous way.
And listen to their feedback
That's
too,
right.
right? And
Yeah,
what they have to say based on, their experiences working
that's right.
specifically in those areas. Yeah.
Okay.
Merck recently launched a campaign called Let's Talk Clinical Trials, which I think aims to expand the number of people who participate in clinical research. Is clinical trial diversity an area that you were focused on in operations?
Absolutely. And it's always been a core of how we work. And you have inherent diversity by our country footprint, but we also have, special focus on our US population, to make sure that we're not, approaching all patients in the same way. Educational methods need to differ, and also engaging in the community has been a big focus for us. Typically in trials, you focus on the site, but we have to go broader than that. And when you look at the US as an example, I think is it 5 to 8% of cancer patients participate in a clinical trial. Whereas many would be interested if they were asked. And, I don't know about you, but, I know friends who've had cancer, and I'm trying to explain to them like where clinical trials could be. Like it's very difficult for a layperson to understand how to even access a trial. It's not all the healthcare providers are going to be giving recommendations for
Right.
potential trials for patients. So education is key. Let's Talk Trials is something that we created for the industry, for clinical research as a whole. It's not specific to Merck, and it's providing education on what are trials, perhaps dispelling myths on what people think trials are, hearing from patients, hearing from community members, understanding all the rigor and ethics reviews that goes into approving a clinical trial. And it's really just putting it out there, in basic terms so people can understand that it is a care option. And here's how you find, ways. ClinicalTrials.gov is a bit of a nightmare to sort through. We have a beautiful website, a clinical trial finder. I know other companies do as well. But the more we can educate as a potential care option, especially when, patients are suffering and they're out of options, to ensure that this is better understood. I think during the COVID era, the public really started to understand, but that fizzled out a bit. So we have to really have more intentionality in our communication about, what clinical trials are. I love Let's Talk Trials, and it's something that many of us who've been in the industry for a while have been really yearning to see, and I'm really proud of our company for putting the effort here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would think part of it too has to do with engaging and educating community providers, and I wonder if this ever thinking about community providers and making sure that they're even notifying their patients about potential, or that the provider themselves knows about the trial and that they're identifying their own patients to potentially participate. I mean, I wonder if that ever, calls to mind some of those early experiences you had with your mother going to, a community health center. I mean, is that something that you're thinking about as well?
Yeah, and I would love, my dream would be like when you get your, electronic health record, it was a printout, from your visit, you get your visit summary. Wouldn't it be great if it sort of automatically populated active clinical trials in your vicinity for maybe a disease that you're suffering from, at least to kind of allow the patient to have a choice and maybe a barcode to get to Let's Talk Trials so they could say like, what is a trial? What does this involve? And really to make it automatic through the healthcare system, to me would be the dream. Continuing to educating communities. It's a strategy that we've deployed through many different partners. This is one, method of doing it, and we've also had intentional boots on the ground to do it as well. But we all need to put our efforts in here to continue to educate and allow patients and their caregivers to make choices.
Right, right. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time here, but before I let you go, Jenna, I wanted to ask about next year. Looking forward to 2026. We're coming up on the end of the year here. What are some of your professional priorities at Merck, and then what are some of your personal priorities?
So, professionally, it's delivering this diverse and vast portfolio with high quality. And we're really focused, as I mentioned earlier, on resetting our operating model with risk-based quality management. So balancing more of the central monitoring with the site, that's going to be a really important focus for us. It is right now and for implementation in 2026. So we're using our roles most effectively on the most important data. So that's really key. I would say creating an environment where we simplify with rigor and we automate at scale. So I built an automation hub, and I'm pairing it up through the functions in our organization. They all sort of have matrix leads into the hub, and building this now into process officially. So it's, we've had a good time with experimentation on things like Copilot and tools, and there's different adoption of great tools like Power Automate and BI and things like that. So it's really simplifying with rigor, automating at scale, and making our work more efficient and productive so we can do more because we know we need to continue to fuel our R&D engine. And from a personal standpoint and professional as well is really taking care of my leadership team, making sure that they have the right skills to help their teams optimize. I need growth mindset and people to get behind why we need to evolve and modernize. So it's making sure I'm bringing my leaders along and supporting them, and then building the future leaders. It's really building the future leaders of clinical trials. It's to me, pairing up some of these heavy tech skills with the clinical skills so that they can come together and sort of have a best of skill set for what this environment needs. And, always as a leader, I think it's important to take care of yourself physically and take care of your health so you show up well for your team. So that's a commitment to me as well as making sure I'm upskilling my digital acumen in this environment too.
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here, Jen. I really
It's a
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
We've been speaking with Jennifer Scheller, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Clinical Trials at Merck. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at lifescienceleader.com. We'll see you next week, and thanks as always for listening.